Welcome to the riskadvisor.com podcast. I am Jim Henry here with my good friend and co-host, Sal Lafreri. Before we begin, I would like to remind each of you to subscribe to this show and push the like button for us. And please leave comments, as your opinion is very important to us. Today's topic is, again, trends in video and the infrastructure of video systems to support those solutions. So, Sal, this is part two. We have Darren Giacomini back. He is the Director of Advanced Systems Architecture for BCD Video. And you and I made a command decision there in that first podcast that if we let Darren get into the weeds right away, we may have people driving into the curbs trying to follow up with him, because Darren's a very smart guy, but a very experienced guy. And we kind of corralled that back into, what the problem is, where the trends are, and what have you. We're going a little deeper this time. So hopefully this approach gets people to get the greatest value out of the great wealth of knowledge Darren brings to us.
So that's one of the big problems that we have with the show, is that we're getting a lot of new technology and new things that are being developed and techniques, and being able to get the end user to understand it. And I think one of the great things that Darren did was in the beginning, and not saying this because you're here, I would say this behind your back, Darren, was, he sort of explained it in a pretty simple and easy way. And in our pre-production meeting with him, when we were talking the first time around, one of the comments I had with Jim when we were done was, I said, he actually makes it where it's understandable. And Jim was like, yeah, but you got to hear him when he starts to get a little deeper. And I said, all right, we can do this, So I've been studying. I listened to the old show, so I'm all set. I'm ready. Yeah,
fire away.
I'm going to play, like the guy in the bullpen watching this. So welcome to the show, and glad to have you.
Thank you.
Well, again, for the listening audience, what we did in the first show was just kind of a little memory lane of, where video has come from, analog video and VCRs, and then we go digital, and then we get on the internet, and of course the infrastructure is changing from reel-to-reel machines to tape machines to DVRs to NVRs and storage, and of course, the C-suite that's trying to keep track of what they're doing with their security systems. Every time they turn around, they're forklifting some other piece of equipment out, and they're buying new, and then the newer their technology gets, the greater the threats are, the greater the costs are, the greater the storage is. And of course, there's that tug of war of, am I really getting value here? And I think that is the breath of fresh air that Darren brings in, because as much as, and I have this tendency myself, I like to, I get intrigued by the latest shiny object, the latest technology, what can it do for us and what have you. But, you've always got to keep your keel in the water of what is our purpose? Providing actionable intelligence to owners at as reasonable a cost as possible and mitigating risk. So, Darren, that really does, tee it up for you.
It can only go downhill from here.
It can only go down here but we'll go back to the benefits that this hyperconvergence concept first brought in, of the technological approach to not having a runaway train with regards to infrastructure. And then as with like tape jukeboxes, I'll kind of diverge on that. When they were first developed for a different purpose, and then security needed it, and they brought those in, but they were never built to be reading and writing and reading and writing and reading and writing over and over and over again. And we ended up with all of those early problems, with the use of that technology. So, security kind of uses video in a different way than broadcast industry or retail or production and what have you. And I think that's why we have to really look at it from a little bit of a different view. Some technologies that work for other industries, they have to be modified and tweaked a bit, for the approach for security. Is that a good way to kind of tee it up for you on defining the problem?
I think so. And Jim, you talk about technologies and things moving forward. Funny story is, not all industries move forward. I will leave the casino nameless, but it was in Las Vegas, and we were looking at moving their infrastructure towards a digital age. And they were still running matrix-based, and they were still using time-lapse video recorders. So this was one of the few casinos that still existed there that had a full-time person employed to rotate the tapes. But more importantly, when I walked into the surveillance room, they had something that was unheard of. They still had a VCR repair guy on staff whose job was to repair VCRs, but he couldn't get parts anymore. So I'm looking at it in this casino, and you've got these matrix bays, and you've got these banks of tapes that people are rotating in. And they've got all these really cool looking old VCRs that nobody's using anymore. And then I look at the bottom quarter of it. There's about 50 of them that are pink. And I looked over at the surveillance director. I said, what in the world is that? And he goes, well, time-lapse VCRs are getting harder to come across. We found a great deal on eBay for 50 pink Pokemon VCRs that supported time-lapse. And it's all we could get. And I looked at him. I said, did you ever think that maybe it's time to technologically move to the next level? So you don't have to hire the last VCR repair guy that cannot get parts and hire 2 to 3 people full time to do nothing but rotate VCR tapes or VHS tapes. And it's kind of a lesson of, as much as we move forward, there's always those people that are going to be in the rears that are just not ready to make that jump yet.
Right. And you contrast that then with the ones that jump too soon. And then they have to have all of these high-end network. Either you got full-time people on your staff to repair yesterday's technology, or you're so far ahead of the wave that you really need CCIEs or some very heavy-duty, IT talent, to be able to manage your systems that are so customized and so, so difficult to drive and to keep running. And the sweet spot is in the middle, right? You want to be using technology that is the state of common usage. I think is better than state of the art, and technology that is intelligent enough to manage a lot of its own, of its own operations, that it can't on its, without human intervention, and allow the people to be digesting the information rather than worrying about, it's so difficult to drive this thing that they're losing the whole point of what the solution is for.
I was looking from the perspective of technology is great. New technology is wonderful, but if it doesn't have a business application, if it doesn't solve a business need, then it's useless. At the end of the day, I look at what do people want out of their surveillance systems. They want their surveillance system to record the video. They want to be able to review the video. And when they go back to review that video, they want to make sure it's actually there. And that's where the problem comes into the industry. There are about 7 common problems that people have with respects to surveillance systems. And they're finite with respects to what you have. You have degraded video, meaning you have artifacting in the video, or you have tiling, pixelization, or tearing. You can have latent PTZ control if you're still using PTZ cameras, meaning you can't control them because you have latent control of them. You can have lapses in video, either live view or recorded video. You can have system instability where the database is corrupt, or you can have devices that fail, meaning that you're archiving something or you're archiving some video. When you go back to retrieve that, what do you do in the event that device has failed? So let's say on a particular site, will it be an airport or critical infrastructure, wherever you're at, you're recording 200 cameras to a particular box or a particular server. Well, what can go wrong in that server? The network can go out and the feed can stop, but generally you're going to know that through some type of alert. You could have systematic failure. The power supply could fail, the motherboard could fail in that server, or you could have the operating system completely corrupt and crash on you. So what happens when you put all your eggs in one basket? All of the video for those 200-300 cameras recording back to one server, and something goes wrong with that server. Now, every video management system platform out there has very, very attractive ways to move video. Meaning, if I have 200 to 300 video streams going to this particular box, and that box fails to respond across the network or fails to respond to the system, I can redirect those video flows to something else. Meaning, I'm going to record it over to another location until I can bring that box back online. But when you're talking about a server, things can go wrong that you cannot bring back. If you blow up the motherboard, you're going to have to wait for parts from Dell or whoever services those particular servers. But what if the operating system corrupts? What if your drives corrupt? What if the operating system drive with the indexing for all the video across the RAID array corrupts? What if you can't get that video back? And that's a real pain point for people, that sometimes people are in a situation where they're archiving video for longer and longer timeframes. And when that video goes away, there's a liability associated. So when you look at the hyperconvergence market, rather than using a single server, we take a cluster of servers, 2, 3, 4, 5 servers, 6 servers, and we put them into a clustered pool of resources, meaning compute, meaning the CPU, the memory, and the storage are all globally shared across each other. And as those video flows go in, that is recorded not across one server, but it's recorded across all of the servers inside that cluster. And we virtualize those operating systems to sit on one of the boxes. In the event that box fails, that particular virtual machine can simply move to another box. But what's beautiful about it is even in the event of an entire box failure, you still have access to all that archival video that existed when you were on a box in that cluster that's now failed. So it does solve some problems with respect to what happens if a server fails. Yeah, I can move the video, but can I still get that video? And HCI,
the application for security, as we'll see as we continue with this, that can also drive the price tag up for the nature of what we're doing here because of the way security systems are used. So we'll take a quick break there and then let you get right into the jugular on that. You are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We invite you to comment on our blog on theriskadvisor.com and to subscribe to us on our social media. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to the webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So, hyperconvergence, great concept, risk mitigation, but tick, 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 tick. And as we're learning about, again, the benefits we've gotten from that approach to mitigate those risks, why don't you go a little deeper into why we're seeing that in its purest form does have some shortcomings?
Absolutely. I always start with from a perspective of, where does hyperconvergence actually fit? If you ask yourself the question, how important is my video? What happens if I can't access my video? And what's the business cost potentially of not being able to access that video that's archived? If the answer to any of those is I can't afford to lose my video, then you can't pin that to a single box, meaning you have to have some type of technology to recover that. And HCI is phenomenal at doing that, but it comes at a price. You're absolutely right. For the last 2.5 years at our engineering lab, I've been testing various platforms with hyperconvergence. And there are some fundamental flaws in traditional approaches to hyperconvergence. First and foremost, in order to maintain the performance standards for most VMS platforms, traditional hyperconvergence that shares all the internal drives of the servers and shares them and writes to that, when a node fails, traditionally has to be able to recover very quickly. And what I found is to maintain most standards as systems scale out, you either have to increase the nodes well beyond what you actually need, or you have to move to an all solid state or SSD tier, meaning all flash to make it operate properly during failure. So as we tested different VMS platforms with these, as everybody's product in hyperconvergence works very well in a pristine environment. Take one of the nodes and unplug it. And when those virtual machines migrate elsewhere and have to start to rebuild some of that data and reaccess it, that's when the problems arise. And that's where we found that the only way really to meet the performance standard was to do an all SSD tier, meaning that all the drives inside of those boxes of the cluster needed to be high performance SSD drives if you wanted to maintain a very high bit rate going into the box. If it's a lower bit rate, not such a problem. But that can be very costly to say I'm going to use all solid state drives. And if you've ever priced out a petabyte of all solid state drives, it almost moves the solution out of the tier, out of the market for being applicable to surveillance.
So a quick question at that juncture. So for some of the designs that you've seen from security consultants for video systems, as an integrator, we would often get into these factory acceptance tests or site acceptance tests where they're testing various subsystems. And of course, for like the UPSs, let's use that as an analogy. You go over, you pull the power, right? You validate that you go on to backup power, right? You restore power and you note that it came back on. How often do you see design consultants that actually exercise the loss of some of those elements of the video solution and consider the recovery costs for those systems that don't have all those flash drives and have such a difficult time climbing back out of the pool that they've been thrown into, that they're fearful of the economic impact of actually doing it the right way, and therefore those tests are not applied the way with the same concept as they do for testing, a UPS system, because that really would expose those vulnerabilities in architecture that didn't build itself for those kinds of calamities.
More often than not, they're not tested at all. One of the reasons VCD Video built our Fresno, California location, and what you see behind me, is that is what we do. We do load testing. We take our systems with Revolve and our HCI or hybrid HCI approach, and we fully load test that. And then we execute their tests under failure to see what's going to happen. There is no guessing with respect to what's going to occur because we put it under a full load test. Most of the HCI players in the market come from the IT side of the market, meaning that they service the IT side of the market, and the traffic flows are dynamically different with respect to hyperconvergence for an IT side and hyperconvergence for video surveillance. Hyperconvergence, the IT side, is sending data out occasionally. Surveillance is constantly bringing in data to a single point, and it has to be addressed accordingly. And what I found is that the majority of the vendors out there, the majority of the HCI solutions out on the market today, you don't know there's a problem until one or two of the nodes start to fail. And when that happens, you realize it's not that it's not going to continue to operate, but you're going to have a degraded performance with respect to what the system can do until you bring everything back up and online.
And again, and 9/11 is 20 years ago, but we should still remember, the number of things that all kind of came together there to really challenge, the systems, that were in place at that time, all the video recording there, in one location, communications, what have you. Nobody ever conceived of the number of interruptions to communications, to the security systems, to the, to every aspect when you have a disaster of that magnitude. And, as Sal and I often say, Murphy was definitely in the security business, an optimist, right? Because that's when stuff happens, and inevitably you could have a camera system of 100 cameras, covering your site. What are the odds that where you do have an incident, you just don't have that right scene or that right perspective, or something happened to that recording or that retrieval? And you're right. All the customer cares about is when I have an incident, I need the evidence, and I don't need it in a degraded mode because I've got some other stuff going on, or the system's trying to recover, or what have you. And trying to educate the end users and the consultants on the importance of performance during those types of difficult situations is so critical. And we've got plenty of examples of those calamities to point to where, whether it be because of breaches or because of failure of architecture or cutting corners or going on the cheap with the storage or the means of communications to the storage, it's playing Russian roulette, and there's way too many bullets in the gun.
Absolutely. The failure scenario was one thing that over the last 2.5 years while we've been evaluating it, we saw the failure scenario as a problem, meaning that it couldn't keep up unless you literally put solid state drives across the board. But that wasn't the only problem that became evident. Asymmetric depletion of resources is a huge issue with traditional HCI or hyperconverged, meaning that, so let's say I start with 3 servers that form a cluster of resources. And those resources are CPU, memory, and storage in that box. So I've got all the storage, and I stripe all the data across all the boxes so I can recover in the event one of those nodes fail. In the world of surveillance, if I look at CPU and I look at memory and I look at storage, which one of those three depletes the fastest? Storage. Every single time. It's always bound by retention. And so what you find is when I have three servers in there and I've got CPU, I've got memory, and I've got storage, I deplete the storage faster than CPU and memory. On average, I may only use 20 to 30% of my CPU and 30 to 40% of my memory during deployment. But when I run out of storage, I have to add another server to expand that out in HCI, maybe 2 or 3 more servers. And I'm not just adding storage, I'm adding more cost of CPU, more cost of memory associated with those. And I'm complicating the infrastructure by that.
Technically, that will work, but you're throwing huge dollars at it, right? Yep. And so either option is no good. Just That's ignoring it, saying I ain't going to cover myself that way. I'll just run the risks of some degraded performance or what have you, or throwing gigabucks at it. So that really kind of tees us up for the focus of the last segment again to understand what this approach is, that you've got with Revolve and how you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. You don't have to throw that kind of money out at it, and you don't have to, you don't have to sacrifice security and take on a bunch of risks. So, again, you are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We invite you to comment on our blog at theriskadvisor.com and subscribe and follow us on our social media. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event, or you would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So that should tee it up for the audience very clearly. They want to eliminate risk and they don't want to go broke doing it. So what does the technology enable us to do here for security surveillance systems? So we're not over investing in elements that just don't need that level of investment.
Well, I draw parallels with hyperconvergence in the surveillance market to what in the networking market software-defined networking was. 4 or 5 years ago, the buzz is about software-defined networking. Yet when you go to somebody, their definition of software-defined networking was different with each person you talk to. Hyperconvergence is a little bit more standardized with respect to what people are doing, but the industry on the IT side and concurrently from BCD's development, we literally came to the same conclusion simultaneously late last year that hyperconvergence for heavily dependent low latency applications is problematic, both because of the asymmetric depletion of storage versus CPU and compute or CPU and memory, and the fact that you're bound to this model where you're adding modules of compute and storage simultaneously. And so the IT side has moved to something, as we have, called disaggregated HCI or HCI 2.0. That means the storage has been disaggregated out of the cluster. Now, you might have some localized storage for VMS platforms that need low latency, very fast first tier storage that then moves off to a second tier. You may house SSDs locally on the cluster, and that's one particular revision of that. But when you remove the storage of the bulk of the video from within that cluster and you leverage a technology that's been out for years and has 5 nines of availabilities like storage area networking or SAN or NAS storage, and you put that on the back end, out of the box that these SAN platforms have 5 nines of availability. They don't fail. And when they do fail, something extremely catastrophic has to happen. So you use that in the back end to store your video. You put your operating systems, you put your VMS platforms, and you put your databases on that cluster of resources in traditional HCI, and you let the operating systems and the VMSs and their databases migrate between the nodes while failing, but you store all the video back on the SAN for backend. You achieve all the same things you can do with HCI, but you do it at a much substantially lower cost while leveraging technology that's honestly more established in the industry, and we know that has a predictable performance variable. When I fail a node, I'm not trying to rebuild a ton of video that was stored on that node. That video is still on the SAN. I move my virtual machine to the next node. and I reconnect to the SAN and the video's all still there. It's a better approach.
And it supports both on-premise storage or cloud storage or a hybrid of either.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're doing with our harmonized platform is the ability to take and create multi-tier, multifaceted storage, where you can have localized storage, you can have SAN storage, and you can even have cloud storage that's pushed out to the cloud and can be shifted back and forth out of the cloud into localized storage and back into that environment. And so, yeah, there's definitely opportunities to be able to take some of that video and do long-time archival storage off-prem if you want to do that. But the big difference is you're not storing the high volumes of video across that cluster. So when a node fails, it doesn't have the overhead of trying to rebuild that. The other thing that they don't tell you about traditional HCI is when you're writing high volumes of video, 2,000, 3,000 megabits per second across that cluster, it's so intensive with respects to that when one of those nodes actually fails, it's incredibly intensive to rebuild. More important, what they don't tell you is to achieve that high bit rate across your storage, more often than not, they're going to do almost like a mirroring technology. So when you look at true HCI to get the highest level of performance, if you need 400 terabytes of storage, you're going to have to specify 800 terabytes of storage plus a 15% overhead for failure, because it's going to duplicate that data across the array, across the striped array of the nodes, so that if a node fails, it doesn't have to work as hard.
So I think we are communicating, where the efficiencies are, where we don't need to make investments that aren't bringing a return. Can you kind of give it some an economic feel for the approach that you're talking about with the disaggregation, and take a nominal, I don't care whether it's 500, 1,000 camera or whatever system for storage for, pick a period of time. What is the order of magnitude of savings versus traditional HCI, where you'd have all that replication in order to mitigate that risk, versus a disaggregated approach or HCI?
When I move the razor coating, which is the technology that stripes it across the cluster, and I move that into the SAN is incredibly cost effective at doing that and can do that with rotational drives. So imagine a petabyte of rotational drives, 7,200 RPM drives that sit in there, high performance server drives, right? And those are all rotational. And then imagine having to buy a petabyte of all flash storage. You're talking at a minimum, in most cases, 6 to 10 times the amount of dollar value to try to create that all flash tier, because let's be honest, they don't make 12 terabyte flash drives, right? You can't get that. So you're going to have to literally increase the volume of drives, increase the number of nodes that you have well beyond what you need on the compute side to hit that storage tier in all flash. Whereas if you're using rotational drives in a SAN, you're not going to have that problem.
Aside from the value engineering of bringing this solution to a customer and showing them how they can, again, have their cake and eat it too, reduce cost and improve performance, are you seeing specifications that are written with that kind of granular detail, inviting or even demanding that kind of an architecture? Or is this still new enough in concept that most specifications out there are traditional HCI?
So most things are traditionally specified HCI today. And when you take a look at things that are out there and people who are going in and they're bidding that HCI, they're often having to value add that to keep it in the realm of price comparison. When you look at bare metal servers versus HCI, yes, there's a benefit to HCI, huge benefit to HCI, but there's a magnitude of cost increase that's associated with that. And so more often than not, they'll value engineer that to try to get it closer down to what the bare metal is to compete. Because let's face it, if you go with a bid that's 5 times higher than somebody else, you're going to lose, period. You're just going to lose. And when you start to value engineer those things, there are things that are lost. And unfortunately for the customer, they don't know that until a node fails and they start to have severe problems with respect to handling the ingress bit rate. They'll get RTP packet loss. They'll get instability of the system. They may have, in one case of one particular vendor that I tested, I had the HCI under full load with our primary VMS platform. Everything was running great. I failed a node. It was having problems, right? It wasn't, literally writing at the same rate I would expect. I went from about a 50 millisecond write latency to about a 400 millisecond write latency going to it. And then later jumped up to 1,000. And when that happens, you start to have problems. You're going to start to have problems with storing that data. But more importantly, when I came in the next day, the whole system had crashed because there wasn't enough buffer allocated for storage area that you weren't going to use for storage, which is typically a 20% overhead saying, here's what you need for storage. You need 400 terabytes. We're going to quote 800. Plus, I'm going to put a 20% buffer in case a node fails so I have extra storage space so I don't run out. Well, that particular platform ran out of storage and everything crashed. You would never encounter that with a hybrid HCI environment. And I'm going to encourage everybody, don't just take my word for it. Look up HCI 2.0 or hybrid HCI or disaggregated HCI is what HP refers to it as. Look at what the IT industry is doing. They're learning that disaggregation of high resource loads away from traditional HCI and separating the storage out is the direction they're going. Well, it's the direction we're going to go as well.
Yeah, the challenge is when you run into specs, and having been an integrator for so many years, you are up against competition that's going to look at the lowest common denominator that may not nearly be as concerned about what the consequences are to the end user, when some of those failures occur. And there's way too many contract awards where, whomever wins the project comes back, after the failure and says, look, I met your spec. I gave you what you wanted. You didn't call for that level of redundancy, nor did they have the motivation or the insight, to propose an HCI 2.0 solution looking a little deeper than what the spec requires. So what it really comes down to is the need for education of the end users and the consultants of the level of risk that is out there if you don't do it the right way, and the level of cost if you do it the conventional right way, and that there is a means by which you can reduce risk and keep the cost in line. But I don't see it yet as the as the rule. It's still the exception where that level of insight and detail are in the specs. So it's really requiring the industry to get that education out there.
It really comes down to this. If you look at what people like about HCI, it's finite with respect to what they like. If a particular server fails, all of those roles from the server, whether it be archiver or directory servers or databases, whatever you have, within 2 to 3 minutes will move to the remaining nodes and reboot and start running again unattended. They love that. Okay, you can get that without HCI. You can get that just with traditional VMware and other technology. The other thing they like is the fact that when that thing comes back online, even though the node failed, all the video and all the data that was stored in that node is still available, meaning I can still get it. So your only outage comes down to the time frame where it took for the actual virtual machines to move from one box to another. And all of that is completely unattended, meaning nobody has to be in there at 2 a.m. manually making changes or moving that. It's self-healing with respect to what it does. Right. You can accomplish all of those goals with disaggregated HCI or HCI, and they're both HCI solutions. At the end of the day, what it comes down to is it really becomes more of an education of, what is the downside in traditional HCI when you need to add nodes, and educating people that when you add a node and you're adding more CPU with these Xeon processors and another 128 or some odd gigs of memory into this system that you're not going to use, there's a cost associated with that. What you really need is more hard drives. And disaggregation of the storage, particularly in this industry, is very attractive because if I have a SAN and I need to double my storage, I can add expansion units underneath that, and I don't have to touch the servers that are over here. There's less interruption. There's less cost associated with it in scaling the storage resources out. And it opens up a whole world of tiering of storage where you can move things out to the cloud as well.
Sal, what do you think? You think we're getting the message across of the value that this disaggregation brings to be able to have your cake and eat it too? I've said that now 3 times.
Yeah, I think the importance of all of this, right, is the education, and it's across all of the different levels, from the consultants who are speccing it, and more importantly, to the end user to understand and know what's out there. I always go back to the end user just not being educated enough to understand. And then ultimately, the guys who are speccing this and who are deciding on it ultimately go to someone who has no concept at all and starts looking at other factors, and you wind up getting things cut back on you. But I think the more of this that gets done, the more education and the more understanding of the systems and the capabilities out there is just going to be something that's going to be more and more helpful, especially with technology advancing with the way it is. End users, for the most part, are pretty lost about what's available.
Well, at best, if an end user has a consultant that's written a spec and they're going through the vetting process of integrators and solutions, and the consultant is engaged, at least there's a chance that RFIs can get to the consultant to kind of vet the viability of this approach to come up with the best solution at the best value. But unfortunately, there are often times where they have a consultant write a spec and he's then excused, and now you're just dialoguing with procurement, with the GC. And when you put an RFI like that, typically you'll get a response that just says, well, just bid to the plans and specs. The spec speaks for itself. And then you're in between that rock and a hard place of, do I do the right thing, right, and make sure that I'm completely covered? Do I take a risk that I propose a disaggregated solution, and am concerned that they're going to come back and basically say, well, we don't understand that. That's not what we asked for, and then hold the integrator responsible to give them a much more expensive solution, not better, just more expensive. Because I've seen plans and specs that say whatever conflict exists between the plans and specs, whatever's the most expensive is what applies, right? And that's when you really have to get to a point where I've got to walk from this, because no good deed goes unpunished here, and it all comes down to the end user not getting caught in this vernacular between the consulting or this procurement process between the consulting industry, the procurement process, the GCs, and what have you, and either integrators that don't know this, or integrators that it's just too risky for them to get in there and start educating and annoying, the procurement manager or the GC, because he can't answer these questions, so he doesn't want to. And he just comes back and says, you have to, bid to plans and specs. And that's where, it's difficult. But some of the best jobs I've ever got are the ones that I walked away from, because I could see those ravines just, and minefields just waiting to blow up in my face, and cost me a ton of money when I could give them a functionally viable solution to mitigate those risks. But, you just didn't have the people at the table to make that happen.
And how many times have we seen it where you have all of that, what you just said, all is going on, and it's the three-ring circus. And then ultimately it gets up to the guy who's going to sign the check, who looks at it and says, yeah, it is too expensive. Go back and do something with it. And you wind up having to waltz right back into that three-ring circus. And
it's 80% of the time. They want, I love the concept of hyperconvergence. This is what I want. Well, I wasn't expecting that bill. It's the same problem with cloud storage right now. It's not that cloud storage isn't affordable on the storage level. It's the bit rate and the service provider links required to actually get it up there. Yeah. And the perpetual cost per month, when they look at it, they say, no, I don't need that. But I will tell you this, what's coming into this industry, and I believe in the next 2 to 3 years, it's going to hit very hard. It's going to come down to virtualization, and hyperconvergence is part of that virtualization and more efficient use of resources on these servers, whether that be in the cloud, whether that be wherever. When you look at virtualization, allows me to compartmentalize CPU, memory, storage, all these resources. And those things that I'm not using. When I create a virtual machine and I use a fragment of the storage, I now free up the rest of that CPU and memory for another virtual machine and another virtual machine.
Right.
And when you start to virtualize that hardware and use it more efficiently, what's going to happen is you're going to go on with a bare metal bit, or you're going to go on with something, and somebody is going to come in and blow you out of the water with 2 servers doing the same thing your 10 servers do at a substantially lower cost. And not only that, the total cost of ownership is going to plummet because of the cost to power on those servers and cool those servers. You're just going to see this revolution happen where people are going to have to start embracing virtualization, because some integrators are going to do it, and they're going to start submarining, these bids at very low cost compared to what people are doing with bare metal.
Right. Well, Darren, again, thank you very much for your insight. Again, for anybody that would like to follow up with you, what would you advise is the best way to contact you?
dgiacomini at bcdinc.com, or you can reach out to the BCD website, and any of our sales staff or any of the contact there can get you in touch with me.
Well, thank you very much. And again, for our end users, look for that keyword, hyperconvergence. And if you don't know much about it, all you need to know is to ask your consultant or whoever's running your procurement, is this conventional old hyperconvergence, or are you up with the times here? Can we be somewhat flexible with this so that I'm not going to go to the poorhouse, buying this solution. So you've been listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We ask you subscribe to the show and like us on our social media sites. We remind you and ask if you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event, or would like to consult with us. Please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. Remember, you can hear the show on your favorite podcast platform, YouTube, and of course, stream it at theriskadvisor.com. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you tune in again next week.
Every day, more people are adding cannabis to their daily routines. At Cresco, we know the best cannabis experiences start with consistent quality products. Our excellent everyday cannabis is designed to bring you the best that cannabis has to offer. Whatever your cannabis ritual is, we aim to make it excellent. Find excellence at CrescoCannabis.com or at your local dispensary. These products are intended for persons 21 plus in Illinois. Individual experiences may vary.
Want to save 17 gallons of fuel every 1,000 miles? You can with the powerful combination of Michelin X1 tires and the Michelin Energy Guard aerodynamic solution on your truck. Michelin X1 tires can reduce rolling resistance up to 30% for more fuel savings. And Michelin Energy Guard helps you control airflow for lower costs per mile. Go to business.michelinman.com/fuel-saver for details and start saving today. Saving today. Saving today. Saving today. Saving today.